Religion has been our biggest problem. It was the Pope who made that statement in 1493, if there are no Christian nations in this new land that you have discovered, I declare those lands to be empty, open for colonization by Christian nations. Christian nations, very explicit. Further, if there are people there and they are not Christians, they do not have a right of title to land. Disenfranchised the whole Western Hemisphere with one statement. We had no idea he said that. We had no idea. And it prevails today. Cheryl versus Oneida Indian Nation, 2005, first notation, Doctrine of Discovery. First notation. That's 1493, Doctrine of Discovery. It's still calling us non-Christians, non-title. So, what has to change, obviously, is that kind of understanding. You know, if there are no Christian nations. So Christianity has been a problem.
When Christianity was introduced to Hawaii, the focus then became humans and, an afterlife. And it really did not focus on continuing this relationship between humans and the land and nurturing that relationship. And it also enabled the society to commodify the land and to change it into a system of private land ownership and buying and selling the land. So that further alienated the Hawaiian people from this historic relationship to the land. And that relationship was broken, and it really wasn't until Kaho'olawe and the whole call to Aloha Aina that we as Hawaiians in my generation began to really connect back to the land and the spiritual nature of the land. And by honoring again our gods, such as Lono of the Makahiki, when the Makahiki on Kaho'olawe was first observed again in 1980, this was the first time that in modern day, the full ceremony was practiced, and we begin that reconnection of the Hawaiian to our spiritual soul as a people, because that Christianity had severed that relationship of our soul to the land, because it focused on our soul in relationship to an abstract entity, which is good, but it still didn't enable us to keep and nurture and honor our relationship as humans to the land and the spirit of the land, which is really the heart and soul of our culture as a people and our identity as a people here in Hawaii, because it's Hawaii that we are related to and are born out of and we descend from. And so that relationship is integral to our identity as to who we are as a people.
What is it about Christianity that severs that tie to the land or nature?
I guess in the Judeo-Christian tradition, we're really looking at humans conquering nature and invoking this spiritual entity to help humans overcome obstacles in nature and control these forces of nature, to harness these forces of nature, to be able to advance technologically and in a materialist fashion, and to use the land and its resources for generating profit in the capitalist system. Ultimately, the land and all resources are commodities, and everything that is commodified can then be bought and sold, and it is depersonalized. But the way that Christianity enables us to do that is you see this importance of using God to harness the forces of nature rather than to place ourselves as humans in a respectful relationship to nature.
The people get their language, they get their kinship system, they get their laws and customs from what we call the Bulgarigara, the dream time, the beginning times, when things were soft on the earth and were moulded and shaped, but couldn't speak, didn't have any way of relating or interrelating. Now, we start from there. Whereas in the Western world, people start from science. They start from deduction. They start from observation of what is there. And they try to analyse that, and they try to interpret rules that go with it. Whereas we are born into a world where we already have meaning. We have meaning because we're born with a particular kinship. We're born with a name. We're born with a spirit being that will return to the land when we die. We know that. And then we know that a part of us also goes to the sky. Now, Western people who follow Christian teachings start with Christ and his teachings and the scriptures and then the doctrines of their various churches. And they try to interpret a world through a Christological prism. Whereas we are constantly engaging with a world that we know is alive. It has a spirituality itself, and we are connected to that spirituality. And we know that how we walk on this earth, wherever we might be, it is important for us to respect the land. I think with the Western Christian views, it's more about morality. It's more about moral codes. It's more about relationships to power and authority. And it's very much linked to exploitation of resources and control and domination of people of difference and subjugating people to a way of life that's alien. That's been the history in Australia, still an ongoing history. We don't have treaties. We've never had a treaty with the Australian government. The British came without our consent. The Australian Constitution was developed without our participation. We have nothing in our Constitution that gives us any security within the legislative framework of the nation, so laws can be passed to destroy our sacred sites.
If you look at the etymology of the word colonization, it has the same root as the word colon. It means to digest. Colonization is the process of the digestion of one culture by another through military, economic, political, religious mechanisms. That is the process that you see historically. That's the process you see now. It depends on where you want to start. You could make the argument quite easily that the papal bulls of the 1490s, which argued and provided the political and religious arguments for colonialism that said basically if you were not Christian, you were not entitled to your land. And you should be vanquished and you should be destroyed. So that is the origins, is this sense of the righteousness of Christendom and the ownership of Christendom of the rest of the world. That turns out that most of the world is not Christian. And despite all these attempts for all these years, there's repeated and repeated attempts, but people have retained or they have recovered, from the Christian colonial process and returned to the people that they originally were because they find that their place in the creation is best discussed in those terms spiritually. And so you have a long process which has scarred people and land, over these years. You have many people who have retained, their songs and their ceremonies despite them being outlawed. Until 1978 with the passage of the American Indian Religious Freedom Act, as an example, I would assume that similar laws were passed internationally to outlaw the practice of, outlaw our religious practices. Because what the government knew is that power resides within our spiritual practice. And so in systematically attempting to replace our power with their Christian churches and then their government agents. They were able to destabilize many of our communities. And that they were pretty successful at for, well over 100 years in many of our communities. We see the scars of that today, whether it is at Hopi with the Mormon Church, or the Catholic churches elsewhere, or the different eras in the Soviet Union, or certainly in Australia. At the same time, you see people who retained connection and never forgot, or somehow, as is in many of our prophecies, woke back up and remembered. And those people remain on these front lines. The government, in many cases, though, has worked well with new deployment of Christian churches into Indigenous territories. You see the consequences of that on James Bay. I'm sure you see it in the tar sands. And you see it in many other areas where in the teachings of these churches, there is a separation of the land that is there from the people. There is a cut of the umbilical cord so that people are not related to the land by the creation stories. They assume someone else's creation story. There is a loss of connection as to how we reaffirm relationship. Instead of having reaffirmation religions, we end up with commemorative religions that commemorate someone else's history, someplace else. Yeah? And then we end up with a belief that it doesn't matter what we do here because salvation is someplace else. And so let them mine. Let them damn. Maybe that must be God's will because our salvation is in the next world. That whole set of religious teachings has very dangerous implications for Indigenous communities and has been absolutely essential to the interests of mining corporations and governments in the religious and spiritual domination of peoples. And so in this recovery of our humanity as Indigenous peoples, where we remember and we recover our things and we remember our songs and we rid ourselves of the cloaks of Christianity or the cloaks of consumerism and remember who we were supposed to be. These spiritual places not only buttress our beings, but are the places to which we must essentially go to keep restoring that relationship and recovering that power of place.
In last few years, humanity has suddenly woken up to the problem of global warming and climate change. Scientists, media, politicians, everybody's talking about big problem of global change, global climate change and global warming. But global warming is a consequence of some actions, human actions. Global warming is not a problem in itself. Global warming is only a symptom of the problem. Now, as Einstein said, you cannot solve a problem by the same mindset and the same tools which created the problem in the first place. Now we have to think, what is the cause of global warming? Our economic activities, our technological advances, our globalization, all these, our dependence on fossil fuel and use of fossil fuel to create this kind of economic growth and technological advancement. Most of the media, most of the government leaders, business leaders, industrialists, most of the scientists, they are saying, let's find a new technology. Let's find a new source of energy. Instead of fossil fuel, let's have biofuel. Instead of fossil fuel, let's have nuclear fuel, even solar or wind power. But we will continue to have our economic growth. We'll continue to have our violence to nature. We will continue to have our technological advancement. We don't want to stop our consumerism. We don't want to stop our materialism. We just want to find a new technological fix. This